I know you're gonna dig this.
This is Rhine McLin, host of the Funk Music Hall of Fame and Exhibition Center's award-winning show, Funk Chronicles, recorded live here at DATV Studios in Dayton, Ohio. Zooming in all the way from Augusta, Georgia, Mr. Corey Washington, the author of the Jimi Hendrix and the Band of Gypsies story. Welcome, Corey. And my co-host for today is Mike Putterball, museum docent and educator at the Funk Music Hall of Fame and Exhibition Center in Dayton, Ohio. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And thank you so much, Corey, for agreeing to be with us today. How are you?
Thanks for having me. This is a very important topic, and I'm glad to have the platform, and certainly something I love to talk about.
You know, first question, I'm just going to give some preliminary background and about you. And you are a school teacher?
Yes, 17 years, middle school and high school.
And what do you teach?
Primarily world history, U.S. history. I've also taught language arts and so forth, but those are my two main subjects.
And you originally hail from New York?
Yes, I was born in Jamaica, Queens, and lived most of my time in New York in Brooklyn, not so far from Coney Island.
And then you navigated your way down through...
Right, had relatives in South Carolina, moved down with my mother, Aiken, South Carolina. Then we moved across the Savannah River to Augusta, Georgia, the home of the godfather of soul, James Brown.
And there you have made your home.
Yes.
Okay. Now, being that you are down there in Augusta, Georgia, the home of James Brown, but a passion for Jimi Hendrix.
Right. And I can't say that it's always been like that, but that's definitely a passion now.
And so 532 pages of passion.
Right, definitely. Actually, my first book was Nobody Cages Me. Kind of can't see, it's kind of backwards, but that was my first book, which was a lot smaller. And then it grew into my second book, Jimi Hendrix, Black Legacy. You can see a picture there. And so it's definitely been a 20-year journey of consistent study on Jimi Hendrix and his connection to the Black community and Black culture.
Okay, so the first question, what led you to Jimi Hendrix that would develop into this 20-year passion? What was it about Jimi Hendrix?
Well, occasionally I would see Jimi Hendrix, but he was always in the context of classic rock, psychedelic rock, hippie rock, Woodstock, Monterey, and so it never really interested me until one day I was watching wrestling. I used to be a big wrestling fan back then, and Hulk Hogan was coming to the ring, and he was playing a Jimi Hendrix song. It was called Voodoo Child, Slight Return. And immediately the first notes, which was kind of like a wah-wah pedal scratch, it kind of took me by surprise, and I was like, man, who is this? And as I listened to the song over and over, I said, man, I gotta find out who this is. And it was Jimi Hendrix. And so I dived into all of his music, starting with the blues, starting with all of his early albums with Jimi Hendrix Experience. And it was like album after album was a mind-blowing experience. And the band of Gypsies really took me for a loop. So, I mean, I was like, man, you got, this guy did everything.
You know, it's, and what are some of the highlights that you have learned about Jimi? The fact that we all know that Jimi was born in Seattle, Washington. We know that he went into the military.
Yep.
We know, yeah, so why don't you fill in, I mean, did Jimi have brothers and sisters? Tell us about Jimi.
Well, like you said, Jimi grew up in the Central District in Seattle, which is a famous black area of Seattle. It's a very rich cultural history as far as music. You know, Quincy Jones is from, he wasn't born there, but he made his bones in that area. Ray Charles made his bones in that area. And so he comes from a rich musical tradition in Seattle. But as you said, he entered the military, which took him to the Nashville area, which he picked up on the Chitlin Circuit area, the R&B. And from there, he went to New York and once again played on the R&B Chitlin Circuit behind greats like Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, Wilson Pickett, all of these classic R&B artists. And eventually, he branched off to Greenwich Village in New York, where he started playing a more eclectic sound. And so from there, he was discovered by Chas Chandler, and they took him over to England, where he became a big star. But he came back home to the United States in '67, and from there he kind of blew up even more. You know, so it's just kind of a weird journey for him, but it's something that, and also he has a brother, Leon Hendrix, that I interviewed in the book. His adopted sister, Janie Hendrix, is running his estate, but he has still quite a number of relatives in the Seattle area.
One of the things, if I can cut in, one of the things I think a lot of people don't realize is the service that Jimi performed as a paratrooper. And I recall, I think it was Dick Cavett had an interview with Jimi, and one of his questions was, Jimi, what's the thing you're proudest of in your life up to this point? And his answer was being a paratrooper. And I think, and that was the Vietnam era. So that's almost like, gee, this guy's feeling like he's a patriot, yet he's coming out and playing music that may be considered anti-establishment. And I've always found that very interesting.
Right. It's certainly an interesting dynamic, because I think on that same Dick Cavett show, he was asked about why did he play the national anthem in such a way. And he kind of answered it in a certain way, but if you really study how he played it, he said that he was playing it as he saw it, you know, from the truth, from his perspective. So like you said, during the Vietnam era, there was a lot of chaos in the air. Everything wasn't beautiful. Everything wasn't gravy, so to speak. So he played it with the sirens and the bombs and things that he saw that was going on, because there was a lot of turmoil, which also led to his other song that he had, Machine Gun. And as you said, he could draw from his experience as a military man. Also, his bass player, Billy Cox, was a military man. So they played from that perspective, and they were actually speaking to the soldiers that were still there fighting, as well as everybody that was in the struggle all around the world, soldiers, foot soldiers, so to speak. They were fighting for equality and against racial suppression.
One of the things that we can definitely come up with when it comes to talking about Jimi Hendrix, he was such ahead of his time. He was really a genius. And he never backed away from being an African American. And he would demonstrate it in so many ways by his music and his actions. So tell me, when you were doing this book about his black experiences, what are the things that you picked up and you documented?
Well, as far as him being in the struggle, as far as him being a proud African American, he was connected with, some people were saying, with the Black Panthers. There's a question about that. He was supported as far as program, as far as the positive aspects, not so much the violence and so forth. And he also contributed to the civil rights movement. I think he donated $5,000 to a Martin Luther King fund. And so he would do all these things that weren't publicized, but, you know, and also he wanted to see more people of color at his concerts, more African Americans. And so one of the vehicles that he used was a free concert in Harlem, New York, September 5th, 1969. And there are pictures of this. There's not much video, but there are pictures that show like a sea of Black people, and they're all smiling and having a good time. And so it's things like that, as well as the Band of Gypsies, where he was trying to reach out to African Americans more.
Mike?
Sorry. No, one of the things that I recall, and that I was teaching here in Dayton, Ohio, from 1968 on for about 15 years. And Ryan and I were talking before the telecast here. I was at Wilburite High School here in Dayton, Ohio. This is 1970. I was a head wrestling coach. And for some reason, my wrestling teams outdrew the basketball teams. And we had halftime celebration, or between matches celebration, and the band broke out in Jimi Hendrix version of the Star Spangled Banner, and the crowd went crazy. And that's what I remember the most. And the thing I think a lot of folks, especially white folks, didn't view Jimmy as being a Black musician because of the type of music he played. Because you got to remember, this is during the Motown era and soul music and what have you. So Jimmy had to breach that gulf between how he was viewed as a musician and as a person. And I think that what you just mentioned, him going out and doing what he tried to do in terms of the Black community, is very, very important, and for people to understand that.
You know, also it's important for folks to understand that Jimmy moved to England. Mm-hmm. He moved to London, England back in 1966, and when he was discovered by Linda Keith. Can you tell us anything about Linda Keith and her impact on his life, Corey?
As far as his life in England?
No, Linda Keith. She discovered him, and that's how he ended up in England.
Right. I think Linda Keith was the one that brought Jimi Hendrix to Chaz Chandler. I think she was a former girlfriend of Keith Richards.
Yes.
And so she was well aware of the rock scene, as well as a big blues. There was some controversy as to whether she was romantically involved with Jimmy, but she said she wasn't. She was just a friend. But as you said, she was very influential in him going to England and getting his start. And I wanted to address something about Jimi Hendrix, as far as a lot of people. I've heard a lot of, as far as some people don't consider him to be a Black man, but both of his parents were Black. So I've kind of always wondered, you know, where do people get that from? Because I know his grandmother or his great-grandmother was like 25% Cherokee, so he has a lot of Native American background, but a lot of us Black people do have a lot of Native American background, because I know myself. So it's just another controversial point, but when you talk about Jimi Hendrix, as far as being a proud African American, there's never any question about that from the people that you talk to about him.
You know, but it's amazing that a lot of people who, I mean, we're giving preliminary and promoting your book, but the fact is that his biggest hits started in the UK. And that was like Purple Haze, Hey Joe, and The Wind Cries Mary. Those were three of top 10 hits that he had with the Jimi Hendrix experience over there in the UK, and then he comes back to the United States, and he takes off in the United States after the Monterey. But we also know that they give him credit for being the outstanding act at Woodstock.
Right. He was the headliner. He was the highest paid. He was probably the only one that was paid for his film rights for the film. And it's an interesting point you bring that up, because through my research in my book, I found out that Jimi actually had 5 top 10 albums on Billboard's R&B charts. And 2 of his albums stayed on the R&B top 50 charts for like over a year. And that was his debut album, Are You Experienced, as well as The Band of Gypsies. So both of those albums had a lot of success on the R&B charts, but those type of things are not mentioned very much at all.
Well, I think it's also to note that he was a businessman, regardless of what you want to think. He was a businessman, because if he was the star act at Woodstock and he got paid and he got the rights to the filming of what happened at Woodstock, somewhere in there, whether it was him or someone that was close to him, had business acumen.
Oh, definitely. But the sad thing about that is his manager, Mike Jeffrey, which is a very controversial figure, was ripping him off and taking most of his money and putting it in offshore accounts. And so Jimi was trying to get rid of him, and it was a bad scene, I mean, toward the end of his life. And a lot of people believe that his manager, Mike Jeffrey, was the one. Jimi was definitely the biggest hit of the late 1960s, but I think he saw that his management was ripping him off, raking in all that money, and they were just paying him like he was a little kid, just peeling off 100 here, 1,000 here. Hey, I want to buy a car. Okay, here's a couple dollars. So he was catching wind of that, and he was getting tired of it.
Woodstock, well, they said Monterey was the one that actually put him on the map, but Woodstock had a significant part of his life. But I don't think that people realized that at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they have a wonderful exhibit of Jimi Hendrix, even down to his note writing. Mike and I were talking about that. So tell us about his note writing, and how did he, is that how he wrote his songs, or did he, and are his songs copyrighted, or is that something else that the family had to negotiate on his behalf after he passed?
Yes, he he used to write his songs on a lot of hotel stationery. Right. And so that's how a lot of them are chronicled. Like, he would write lyrics at this hotel, be somewhere in Utah, somewhere in Denver. And also he liked to make little doodles or little cartoons on his, it kind of looks like Mad Magazine. And in addition to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame having an exhibit, there's also one in Seattle. If you ever go to the, they call it the Museum of Pop now, but it was modeled after the Jimi Hendrix, but they have a lot of his memorabilia there. And so also Jimi Hendrix wrote the majority of his songs. So they're all credited to him, except for obviously Hey Joe was not his song. No, All Along the Watchtower was Bob Dylan, but most of his hits, Jimi Hendrix wrote those.
It's also interesting to note that his final studio album was the Electric Ladyland. And that became #1 in the United States. And it was Hendrix's most successful album. in the United States and his only #1 album that he ever had. But what I'm leading up to, that Jimi Hendrix died when he was 27, but the epitome of his career was for 4 years.
Right. Electric Ladyland was a groundbreaking classic album, actually a double album, and it featured fusion. If you listen to most of the songs, sure, you'll hear a lot of rock, but you also hear a lot of blues, a lot of jazz, a lot of funk. And so it was a very unique album and considered his masterpiece. And like you said, very successful all along the Watchtower, which was his highest charting pop hit. I think it hit the top 20. So there was a lot of interest around that. And like you said, he was dead like 2 years later. I think the last album that he actually oversaw personally was the Band of Gypsies album, which was released March 1970. And all albums after that were released after his death. So he certainly left a lasting legacy, no doubt.
Well, I think, if I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, that the bulk of his albums came posthumously.
Right.
And if you go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you can see that, because at least the last time I was there and they had the exhibit, they had all of his albums on the wall. You can just go album by album by album. And as I recall, the one lyric that they have is Purple Haze, and it is on hotel stationery, if I recall.
Right. Cry of Love, Rainbow Bridge, Hendrix in the West. I think there was even a Otis Redding, Jimi Hendrix album released from Monterey. I mean, and then they had all of these bootlegs that came out that people were all of a sudden wanted to cash in on Jimi Hendrix. Even some of the R&B people that he played at their sessions, they all of a sudden wanted to turn his guitar up in the mix, bring the horns down or whatever, and say, hey, look, Jimi Hendrix played on our album, and then they would sell it. So, I mean, there was a lot of exploitive behavior after his death, definitely.
Yeah, and I happen to have a Lonnie Youngblood album, which is one of those that you're talking about. Youngblood made his name playing Hendrix stuff.
Yeah, Lonnie Youngblood, another, he's from Augusta, Georgia.
Okay, didn't realize that.
Yeah, you listen to, I think it was Georgia Blues, and Hendrix is playing the guitar, but Lonnie is singing, and he actually says Augusta, Georgia on there, so I've met him before.
Okay.
You know, one of the other things that's really interesting is that what Jimi Hendrix did with his guitar. You know, he was one of the first ones that really worked with the amplifier and the foot pedal. You know, he popularized that kind of playing by the guitar with the feedback to it. And while we're talking about Jimi Hendrix, and when we listen to some of these things, there is a similarity of him to a Prince. And one of those is that all the albums the music that came after he passed, Prince had his all locked up and protected it. But you see, there are some similarities between those two, because both of them were genius. Both of them were genius.
Yes, definitely. A lot of similarities. I think in my book I break down some differences, but there's also more similarities when you look at Jimi and Prince. They'll both always be bound by the color purple. Purple Haze, Purple Rain. And then, of course, two talented black musicians on the guitar. Prince would incorporate more James Brown dance moves when he played, and of course he had a more powerful voice than Jimi, but they were also two guys that would wear like similar imagery as far as clothing. Jimi Hendrix would wear these like, some would call them feminine clothes, but they were kind of had ruffles or almost looked like a blouse. And of course, during Prince's heyday, during the Purple Rain era, he would wear the same type of stuff. So, I mean, those two will always be linked when it comes to not saying who's better than the other, but we know Prince came after Jimmy. So Prince always showed respect for Jimmy and even covered some of his songs as well.
But, you know, and I think that, but you still haven't really said, how did you get into this love? You talked about the voodoo song that you heard at the wrestling, but we really haven't delved into, Corey, what is keeping you going on Jimi Hendrix?
Okay, let's see.
First, let me ask you this. Do you play an instrument?
I've tried to play an instrument, but what I do, I don't even call that playing. But I got a guitar sitting over there in the corner. I got a bass sitting over there in the corner. But I've heard some great musicians, so I won't even try to claim that I play an instrument.
So I'm trying to. I want you to tell us what's that fire burning about Jimi Hendrix with you?
Okay. Now, when I was in college, I wrote a paper called "Why is Jimi Hendrix Unappreciated in the Black Community?" And it started me off doing some research and some, preliminary research. And I came from the perspective as a guy that thought that Jimi Hendrix originally was a sellout and all those kind of negative things. And it was kind of like I was ashamed of that because it was like, man, this guy is one of the greatest of all times. I missed out on a lot. And so I started thinking to myself, how many people are out there that look like me, that came from that same type of environment, that believe these same things about Hendrix? So I said, you know what? I'm not going to let them go through what I went through. I'm going to compile this information. I'm going to go out and talk to people and find out the real reason why there's such a disconnect between Jimi Hendrix and the Black community, because it's not as simple as, oh, he played white music. Because when you do the research, he played on the R&B Chitlin circuit all those years. He played the Band of Gypsies. He played a lot of his music toward the 70s was very funky. Dolly Dagger, Easy Rider. And so it's just not as simple as that. So once I found out all this information, I was like, man, I need to put out a book. And I put out my first book and I said, there's just so much more information. And I used to have a blog talk radio show where I would bring people on and they would talk about Hendrix and tell everybody. And so I had all of this wealth of information. And I didn't just write books, but I would also be online on social media, and I would hear all of these mistruths about Hendrix. And so it was always so it was almost like I became an activist, a writer/activist for Hendrix. And a lot of people came up to me and said, look, I really appreciate what you're doing. Keep it up. I'm a Black guy. I love Hendrix. And I thought that, I was the only one that was like this and that. And so it was a way for us to connect everybody together. And so once I saw the value of what I was doing, it just spurred me on to do more and more.
When we look about, I'm going back to his military, because he was a young kid, and in those days, if you got in trouble, you got two choices. You could really go to jail or go to the service, and so he chose the service, and when he went, he left his guitar in Seattle with his daddy, and after he got there, he was going through all, and you can, think about this. You think about this guy who's really a talented musician, going through basic training, which is nothing but physical, and what they do is they verbally abuse you going through the process. And coming out on the other side, and his girlfriend, I think her name was Betty
Jean.
Betty Jean, and with Betty Jean, was his girlfriend, and so he finally asked his dad to send the guitar. And I was going to, the question I'm going to ask you is, do we still have the red silver tone guitar? Because he wrote on that guitar, Betty Jean to Fort Campbell.
Right. I'm not sure where it's at, but I know exactly the guitar you're talking about. A lot of the performers back then had a way of naming their guitars. We know that B.B. King had Lucille. And so you gave me some research. I'm gonna have to go and see if somebody owns that guitar, because I'm pretty sure it has to be famous.
Oh, and it was red.
Right.
And it has that inscription on it, Betty Jean to Fort to the Fort whatever the Fort
Campbell, yeah.
Yeah, the Fort Campbell. Now the other thing that I was going to ask about that, Betty, did you ever interview Betty Jean?
No, I never interviewed Betty Jean in Seattle. I need to find out if she's still living. I'm supposed to be going to Seattle on the 16th, so I guess when I get there, I'll ask around.
Ask about Betty Jean.
Yeah.
Mike, I see you have a question you want to ask. I'm sorry. This is just so exciting for me.
From my perspective, the disconnect between Jimmy and the black community, I think, may partly be because, at least in my experience, he was the first black musician. You know, I mean, I love the man from day one, but he had a backup. His backup musicians were white, and I don't think that was a common thing at that point in time. So I think that may have led to some of the disconnect between Jimmy and the black community, from the standpoint of he's not coming across as a black man because of his white backup performers. I don't know. That's just my personal opinion.
Right, I've heard of that as well. Jimmy with the two English guys, Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell,
right.
During the height of the Black Power movement, with the Black Panthers and a lot of militant behavior. And it's kind of interesting because at some point, you know, those guys played together, but he brought his army buddy, Billy Cox, back in the mix. So you had several different lineups. You had at Woodstock, you had the Gypsy Sun and Rainbows, where you had Jimi Hendrix with Mitch Mitchell, and then you had a Puerto Rican guy, Jerry Velez, a black guy, Juma Sultan, a black guy, Larry Lee on rhythm guitar, and a black guy, Billy Cox, and Jimi Hendrix, another black guy. And then you also, after that, you had the band of Gypsies, 3 black guys, and then his final lineup before he died was Jimi Hendrix, Billy Cox, 2 black guys, and Mitch Mitchell. So I guess the point goes back to the Jimi Hendrix experience being marketed so heavily and pushed so much that a lot of people think that's all who he played with. And that's the only lineup that was inducted into the Rock Hall. They didn't even bother inducting Billy Cox into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is some controversy behind that.
Because Billy Cox was the guy that he hooked up with when he was in the service.
Right, longtime friend, Billy Cox.
Yeah.
And I think that admixture that you've described here probably contributed to some of the feelings that the black community expressed in not knowing where Jimmy maybe was really coming from.
Right. And if you listen to his music after he died, I mean, he influenced black music as much as he did white music, because look at all the funk acts that came in the 70s. I mean, Dayton, Ohio is Exhibit A. All of that funk guitar, you know, this people not just playing the traditional chicken scratch like Jimmy Nolan from James Brown. I mean, these guys were playing some complex guitar solos. Phaso, Slave, which is one of my favorites. I mean, just listen to Slide. I mean, listen to all of their albums. I mean, you can't deny Jimmy's influence on black music.
Okay.
And you know, the thing where he played the guitar with his teeth, and In fact, there is a guy here in Dayton, I think his name is Tony Allen, who is a Jimi Hendrix, I guess you want to call him impersonator. He performs and plays a guitar like a Jimi Hendrix. I guess, they have Elvis Presley impersonator. Yeah, that's what Tony Allen would be. A Jimi Hendrix impersonator. That he goes all around the country emulating Jimi Hendrix from even playing the guitar with his teeth. And that was something that was so unusual. I think his dress, as you stated earlier, was so unusual. His whole presence, his whole approach to music was so far ahead of his time that we know that because of look at all the music that came afterwards.
Right. When you talk about the showmanship, which Jimmy picked up in Nashville, Tennessee, there were a lot of African-American R&B guitarists in that area, and that was one of their trademarks. I mean, it comes from the blues guitarists doing a lot of the tricks. Chuck Berry had his duck walk, but Jimi Hendrix was such a huge star that everything he did, even if he didn't originate it, people look to him as being one of the originators of it. So anytime a guitarist plays with their teeth, plays behind their back, between their legs, or if they have a bandana on or they wear some flamboyant colors on stage, they're going to be compared to Jimi Hendrix, and that's just how powerful he was.
Okay, could you correct me once again? This is one of these. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall, it's been a while since I've read on this. Is that one of the reasons Jimmy wanted to go to England was to hook up with Buddy Guy, who he considered to be the guitar player of guitar players. Now, am I correct on that, or am I wrong?
I believe you meant Eric Clapton.
Okay, it could. I thought Buddy Guy too. I forgot about Eric Clapton.
Well, Buddy Guy was definitely one of his heroes, but as far as going to England, he wanted to go over there and meet up with Eric Clapton, who was considered a guitar god over there.
Right.
And when you read the stories on it, Jimmy went over there and blew him away and just pretty much totally embarrassed him. He wasn't trying to do that, but that's just how good Jimmy was. And every guitarist in England immediately took notice. Jeff Beck, all those guys, Pete Townsend, and he became an instant success once he did that. Okay. I think the song that he played was Killing Floor. He played it so fast, those guys over there didn't know how he did it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've heard that version. I'm not sure where.
Yeah, he played it at Monterey. He played Killing Floor at Monterey.
Okay.
When we talk about Jimi Hendrix, his legacy is so great that it almost seems like it's still alive. And maybe a lot of people don't realize that Jimi Hendrix actually won an Apollo contest.
Right.
Yeah.
First place at the amateur Apollo, definitely.
And that's one of those things that that a lot of times our young people need to understand, that when he reaches stardom, it was a painful journey to where, from the Apollo to the chicken circuit to even his whole military duty. They finally just let him out the military. He's basically, what they said is that he was unadaptable to military life. They didn't give him they gave him a general discharge because it just wasn't for him. But see, to show you the difference is that when they drafted the Elvis Presleys, they utilized what they were and allowed them to be. And that's the difference. And I'm sure that knowing his experience with the military, Jimmy didn't really have anything positive to say about his military experience, which is not unlike for any African American during those times to have served in the service.
Right. Jimmy was all about his music. I think that's why he wasn't compatible with military life.
Right.
Even though he was able to check out an instrument and playing the military band, and that's actually where Billy Cox met him, because he heard this guy playing somewhere with this guitar, and he said it sounded like a combination of Beethoven and some sort of blues, and so he was able to check out his instrument and go play off bass, but a lot of times he didn't want to come back to bass and check in. So that that's where his heart was, and eventually he had to follow his heart.
And a lot of times he was backup band for the Isley Brothers. I mean, he played backup for the Isley Brothers, and the Isley Brothers are from Ohio.
Right.
And he played backup for a lot of different folks in his career as he was being recognized. Now, this question I have to ask you, Corey.
Yes.
With all the research that you've done, you're probably a Jimi Hendrix reincarnated spirit because of all the writing and things that you've done about him. What do you think how would he be today?
I think that when you look at the trajectory of music, he died in 70. Parliament Funkadelic, Funkadelic was just beginning to take root with Eddie Hazel. Eddie Hazel was greatly influenced by Jimi Hendrix. I think if Hendrix would have lived, he would have definitely hooked up with Parliament Funkadelic, Eddie Hazel, Michael Hampton. He would have saw all of these funk acts from the 70s, Slave, and a lot of that stuff, the template was set with the Band of Gypsies, because you had a rhythm section of Billy Cox and Buddy Miles on drums, locking in, and Jimi Hendrix going wild on guitar. And sometimes he would come back to earth and do a little rhythm, but then he'd go right back to his solos. And so once he would have heard all of these groups that were influenced by him, it would have took his music to new heights. But Jimmy was getting funkier and funkier. A lot of that 1967 music was, he really didn't even want to play a lot of that stuff. People would just request it, and he would get frustrated at concerts, and he was like, this is a oldies but baddies type song. He was ready to move forward. And so definitely Jimi Hendrix would have been deep into the funk. He probably would have explored jazz a little more, because jazz became funkier. So I think whatever you say about Jimi Hendrix, you got to add funk in there. He would have definitely got funkier.
Let me ask you the big question here. How do you think, where would Jimmy be politically, given the current atmosphere, had he lived?
I think that when you listen to his song Machine Gun, and he talks about people being almost like cannon fodder, and he talked about how evil man, make me kill you, evil man, that kind of talk. He would definitely be against wars. Not saying he would be a Democrat or Republican, but he was always one that sided with the oppressed and not the oppressors. So I'm thinking that he would have probably called out both sides. But as far as, a movement like Black Lives Matter, that's a no-brainer. Jimi Hendrix was a black man. I'm pretty sure he believed that his life mattered. And if he would, from the concerts that he did, dedicate songs to the Black Panthers, that shows that he had no fear as far as supporting the oppressed. And to the point where he actually has a heavily redacted FBI file that they used to keep tabs on him everywhere he went. And even though people have filed the Freedom of Information Act, they still won't release a lot of this stuff. It's still heavily blacked out. And so that causes a lot of people to, there's no question about it that he was on a list of people to be rounded up in the case of an event like, say, a 9/11 or something like that. So he was definitely a controversial figure among those at the top, those people who look to oppress people and so forth.
Okay.
I want to thank you, Corey, for this wonderful interview about Jimi Hendrix. And it's been fascinating. And we wish you much success on your book of the band Jimi Hendrix, the author, the Band of Gypsies story. From Corey Washington, a school teacher who found a passion about Jimi Hendrix and his Black experience of life. This is his second book. And we want to thank you so much for joining us on Funk Chronicles.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
This is Rhine McLin, host of the Funk Music Hall of Fame and Exhibition Center's award-winning show, Funk Chronicles. Until the next time, let's keep it funky. Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome.
Thank you.